Okay, so this video is going to be about why traditional Catholic women veil. I'm making this video at the request of a subscriber who told me that when most women ask why they're supposed to veil when they go to a traditional Latin Mass, they're just told, oh, well, St. Paul said so, or it's in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, or because it's traditional, but they're not really given anything more than just very generic surface level explanations. So we're going to go into some of the more theological reasons as to why women wear veils and kind of explain the tradition and custom behind that. Okay, so it's a well-known fact that traditional Catholicism and veils are very closely associated with each other. We all know that whenever Our Lady appears at one of her apparitions, such as at Fatima, La Salette, Lourdes, etc., she's always wearing a veil. She never has her hair fully uncovered. She always shows up with a veil. We know that nuns wear veils, or at least they did always before Vatican II. There's a veil over the altar. Sometimes even the communion rail in front of the altar has a cloth over it. There's usually a veil in front of the tabernacle in traditional Latin Mass churches. So veils and traditional Catholicism are very intricately linked with one another. But why specifically do women veil in traditional Catholicism? So first I'm going to read out the famous quote from St. Paul that everybody talks about. Second, I'm going to read out the bit of canon law that everybody talks about. And third, I'm going to use part of the explanation from a sermon of an SSPX priest, and I will actually link to his sermon below. Okay, so first off, here is St. Paul. And this is from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11. Quote, "Be ye followers of me, as I also am of Christ. Now I praise you, brethren, that in all things you are mindful of me, and keep my ordinances as I have delivered them to you. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying with his head covered disgraceth his head. But every woman praying or prophesying with her head not covered disgraceth her head. For it is all one as if she were shaven. For if a woman be not covered, let her be shorn. But if it be a shame to a woman to be shorn or made bald, let her cover her head. The man indeed ought not to cover his head, because he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. For the man was not created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Therefore ought the woman to have a power over her head because of the angels." And a footnote here says that a power, that is a veil or covering, as a sign that she is under the power of her husband, and this the apostle adds because of the angels, who are present in the assemblies of the faithful. Continuing on. "But yet neither is the man without the woman, nor the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, so also is the man by the woman, but all things of God. You yourselves judge. Doth it become a woman to pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you, that a man indeed, if he nourish his hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman nourish her hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering." End quote. Okay, now on to the 1917 Code of Canon Law. So Canon 1262 stated in part, quote, "Men in a church or outside a church, while they are assisting at sacred rites, shall be bareheaded, unless the approved mores of the people or peculiar circumstances of things determine otherwise. Women, however, shall have a covered head, and be modestly dressed, especially when they approach the table of the Lord." End quote. And the 1917 Code of Canon Law was fully in effect until 1983. The 1917 Code of Canon Law was ordered by Pope St. Pius X in 1904, though it didn't come out until 1917, which was after Pope St. Pius X's death. Pope St. Pius X was very famous for his role in combating modernism in the church, which is why Archbishop Lefebvre named the Society of St. Pius X after Pope St. Pius X. Considering how anti-modernism Pope St. Pius X was, it makes sense that the code of canon law he ordered would so clearly enshrine such a traditional practice as veiling. Now, just to be clear, the practice of veiling had been around in the church for centuries before the 1917 Code of Canon Law, but with modernism starting to creep into the church, a lot of people were questioning some of the traditional practices, so the 1917 Code of Canon Law just made it clear that, yes, this is not optional, this is something that you have to do. Because many people today, if you bring up the fact that traditional Catholic women tend to veil, will say, oh, well, it's nice for women to veil every now and then if they want to as a sort of personal or private devotion, but it's never been required. They don't have to do that. It's not something that they've ever had to do. It was just, the fashions at the time. Everybody in the Middle Ages wore veils just, for pure fun. Of course, there was no rhyme or reason for anybody in the Middle Ages doing that. They all just did it for fun because they wanted to. And the 1917 Code of Canon Law made it quite clear, no, that's not some kind of option or something that you choose whether you want to or whether you don't want to do it. You're going to do it. Okay. So why exactly do women have to veil? What's the whole story behind this? Especially, why do they have to veil in church? Because the traditional Catholic rules have always been the women definitely do have to veil inside of church, but they don't necessarily have to veil outside of church. So why is that? Why outside of church is it fine for them not to wear a veil, but inside of church they have to wear a veil? What's going on there? So to understand that, we're going to have to go look back at Adam and Eve. Okay, so when God first created Adam and Eve, the woman was supposed to be the ambassador, or women, I should say plural, were supposed to be the ambassador of God's beauty, and men were supposed to be ambassadors of God's strength and authority. Now, the beauty that women were supposed to be ambassadors for was not just purely physical, so that it included love and care for children. That was part of women's beauty. Maybe women sacrificing themselves for their families, their kindness, their graciousness, how ladylike they were, etc. That was all encapsulated within women's beauty. And Adam's role and the men's role was strength and authority. The men were supposed to be heads of the family. As most of the people watching my channel know, traditional Catholics believe that men are the heads of the family. So it's not like men and women get married and they're like, oh, well, we're both equal here. No, they have different roles. And the man is kind of the king over his family, so to speak. Now, back during the creation, Adam and Eve, as you all probably know, had their instincts perfectly under the command of their reason and will. So that meant their self-discipline and self-control is far stronger than it is now. They had almost perfect control over their bodies. They were actually far more intelligent than anyone today is. But once they chose to eat the fruit, their soul at once broke away from God, and it broke their subjection to God. The lower nature of men and women broke their subjection to God. So what are the lower faculties? It's the things that want food, sleep, sex, anything like that. Basically, if you see cookies on the kitchen table and you just can't stop reaching your hand towards oh, cookies, that's your lower nature taking over, because you don't just snap in your mind and say, no, I'm going to take control of my body right now. I'm shutting that craving off. I'm not going to eat those because it's before dinner or whatever. You basically just can't help yourself. That's your lower faculty taking over. Same thing when you wake up in the morning and your alarm's going off and you say, I'll just 5 more minutes, just 5 more minutes. That's your lower faculty, basically meaning you don't have control of yourself anymore. Your mind is not fully in control. Now your lower faculty is taking over. And that is basically something that Adam and Eve at first never had any problems with. It was never an issue for them. After the fall, it was an issue for them. And the SSPX priest whose talk I linked goes a little deeper into this. And he says that after the fall, basically, Adam was no longer able to look at Eve, because since they were unclothed, Adam was no longer able to look at Eve as anything but an object. And he says that Adam, since he lost control of his body, remember, Adam lost control of the movements of his body when he saw Eve. And he phrased that very delicately. I'm not going to go into it, but you all can guess exactly what's going on there. And so then Eve was ashamed because she had once been admired not in kind of a sensual way, but just for her overall beauty, graciousness, etc. And now that they had both fallen, that was lost, and nobody was looking at her as anything more now than an object. And as the priest put it, sensual beauty that can inflame lust has no place in the church or in Christian life, period. So God intervened here by giving men and women garments. And this helped women look beautiful modestly without letting the instincts of men fully take over it. Finally, let the women now be looked upon with respect and dignity. And you can kind of see this after the fall. There were many things that were supposed to happen in Christian life that God kind of had to put in little helps for. So, for example, we were supposed to be around God all the time. After the fall, we were cut off from God, but eventually we got the Eucharist, so we got that back. Before the fall, we were supposed to focus on God completely. Now that we have to start looking at acquiring like wealth and property and whatnot to stay alive in the world, it's much harder to focus fully on God because we have to do things in the world. But he did give us the religious states or the contemplative life so people can go become monks and nuns, etc., and they can fully focus on God. So there's lots of little things that God put in to kind of help us out there. Okay, so what does this all have to do with veiling? Well, remember, the women were supposed to be ambassadors of God's beauty, and the men were supposed to be ambassadors of God's strength. And the men, especially after the fall, and the women after the fall, ended up having two very important symbols of their roles as ambassadors. The man's symbol of his strength and authority was his hat. And if you think about this, how do you tell when a king walks into the room? Well, he's got a crown on, because a hat is kind of the man's insignia of his office of authority. And if you actually look, we don't wear hats that much these days, but if you actually look throughout history, you could actually tell kind of what quote-unquote class somebody was in by what hat they wore. So if they were like really rich, for example, maybe they would wear a top hat, back in the 1900s. If they were in the working class, maybe they'd wear a cloth hat. Same thing, back in medieval Europe, if they were rich, maybe they'd wear some very fancy felt hat or something like that. Whereas if they were, say, a serf, maybe they'd wear like a hood, just a regular old hood, and so on and so forth. And you can even see that within the clergy of the Catholic Church. If you're the Pope, you're supposed to wear the papal tiara, though they've done away with that, which is kind of telling that we've actually done away with hats both inside and outside of the Catholic Church. But the Pope wore his papal tiara, the bishop wears his mitre, and then the priest wears his biretta, and so on and so forth. So that is why, in case you're wondering and you've kind of caught on, that's why when men enter into a church, or they pray, they're supposed to take their hat off. And I'm willing to bet many of you have never really thought about that, or if you have, you've probably forgotten about it. It's just something you do instinctively now. But it was because the hat was the man's symbol of authority. And an ambassador, typically, at least in medieval times, would receive honor in the name of the king. So they would say, okay, since the king isn't here, we'll give the honor to the ambassador instead. However, whenever the king is present, the role of the ambassador is to disappear, to go away. And as I've talked about in many of my previous videos, and many of you know, well, first off, you all know that the church is the house of God. God is quite literally sitting inside of the tabernacle in a traditional Catholic church. But I've also talked in many of my videos about how traditional Catholic churches are quite literally designed like throne rooms. The golden tabernacle sitting at the end of the room is kind of like the throne. The long aisle leading up to the altar is kind of like the aisle leading up the middle of the throne room. And then you've got the people on either side of the aisle leading straight up to the throne. The altar itself is kind of like the steps leading up to the king's throne. And then you've got the rail that separates all the people in the back from the priest who goes up. He's kind of like a nobleman or somebody who works with the king. And then you've got all the altar servers who are kind of like pages of the heavenly court, and so on and so forth. And it makes sense because God is a king. He really is. A lot of people just think of him as like this wonderful, loving person. He is, but he is a king, and you're supposed to treat him like a king. Okay, so we've talked about men's hats being the symbol of their authority. Now, the key thing here is that a woman's hair was now, after the fall, the symbol of her beauty. And I've talked about this before, too, in some of my videos. According to traditional Catholic beliefs, and men and women are generally supposed to have their arms covered up to their wrists. Their The rest of their bodies covered up to like their necks. I think it was Pope St. Pius X who said like a woman's dress should never be more than two fingers below their neck. And the men are supposed to wear pants generally that come down to their ankles at least, and the women are supposed to wear skirts and dresses that come down to their ankles as well, generally speaking. That is the general guideline that we go with. And so for those of you like, wait a minute, does that mean that women aren't supposed to wear pants? Yeah, that means that women aren't supposed to wear pants, but I'm not going to get into that in this video because that's a whole nother topic in and of itself. So generally speaking, since men and women's bodies were fully covered, the only place left that the men really had to show their insignia was the top of their head for their hats. And for the women, it was their hair, actually. Many of you have probably heard that a woman's hair is her crowning glory. That's a phrase that's typically repeated, especially in some of the older books, if you will read those. And that is actually why the women wear a veil in church, is because they oftentimes, so remember, the women are supposed to be ambassadors of God's beauty, and the men are supposed to be the ambassadors of God's authority. And since the insignia of a man's authority is his hat, the man will remove his hat to show that he is actually now subject to God and that his authority is nothing compared to God's. And he will also show not only that his authority is nothing compared to God's, but also that he is now subjecting himself to God whenever he enters a church. Because if he takes off his own crown in the presence of God, he is saying, I am under your authority, my authority is nothing compared to yours. And that also means that anyone underneath the man's authority is also subject to God. So when the man takes off his hat, he is saying, everybody who is loyal to me and under my authority, basically my wife and children, are also under your authority as well. So first off, of course, like, the women can't wear hats because, they don't take off hats usually like the men do, because the women's roles are completely different from the men's. But the women's role was that of beauty, and the women veil themselves to show that one, they're just the ambassador of God's beauty, and so they will kind of fade away or go away in the presence of God's beauty. But two, on top of that, they acknowledge the fact that they are nothing compared to God's beauty. Their beauty cannot possibly hope to compete with God's in any way, shape, or form. And so that is why whenever men and women enter church, the men will take off of their hats, and that is why the women will veil their hair. And the nuns are constantly veiled because their consecration continuously places them in the presence of God, and their duty to God in that sense takes precedence over their roles of ambassadors of beauty. And I will also add onto this, some people will say that, one of the primary reasons that many women wait so long to start veiling is because of fear of other women's reaction to them. And it's not because they don't want to veil, it's because women are very worried oftentimes about, especially when they change up whatever they wear, what other people will think about them. And I've actually heard that, many people will say, the traditionalists are so picky about what women do or don't wear. But I've actually heard that many women will actually go to a traditional Latin Mass for the first time. They've never been there before, and they're always worried, like, are people going to scold me because I'm not wearing a veil and I don't have one? And then nobody says anything to them. Nobody reproaches them. Nobody talks to them and says, hey, you need to start wearing a veil. They just kind of leave them alone. On the flip side, when many of those women eventually do start wearing veils and go back to the Novus Ordo churches, many of the priests and lay people there will actually criticize them for wearing a veil. So I have heard, I think, one story of a woman getting criticized for not wearing a veil in a traditional church, but that was like a really, really radical traditional church. It wasn't associated with any of the typical Latin Mass societies. And so also, too, in traditional Catholic circles, usually the unmarried women wear white veils to symbolize their purity, and the married women wear black veils. And I also did a little bit of research and found that throughout a good chunk of medieval Europe, it was actually more so the custom for married women to wear veils and for unmarried women not always to wear veils outside of church. It could vary a bit from region to region, but generally speaking, when a woman, especially a married woman, wore a veil, she was kind of showing everybody that she was taken. She belonged completely to her husband now, and she wasn't really interested in showing her hair off to the world all that much because she belonged to her husband and she was going to try to be modest in that sense, whereas the unmarried women would not wear the veils because they were still on the market and they were open to having a husband. And I actually found it was kind of funny. I think there was one town, it might have been a few more in in a medieval Europe, where it was actually the law that a respectable woman, if they saw a prostitute wearing a veil, they were actually allowed to rip the veil off of the prostitute, because the prostitute was basically being a hypocrite and trying to practice false humility or false modesty when they had no intention of being modest whatsoever. I have also heard that the veils are supposed to be because women represent the brides of Christ, the bride of Christ, which is the church. I haven't found anything to back that up, though, so I'd be kind of skeptical of repeating that or taking that one for granted. I couldn't find anything that said there was actually any proof of that. Okay, so I hope that shed a little bit of light for you on why women in Catholic churches veil and why men don't wear their hats.